everyone. I am Rachel Spence from the Cobourg Public Library, and we are here today with both Abigail Miller from the Northumberland County Archives and Dan Buchanan, the author of the Wreck of HMS Speedy, the tragedy that shook Upper Canada. So Abigail is here today to interview the local history guy, Dan Buchanan, about his fantastic book that we also have here at your Cobourg Public Library. So I will hand it over to you, Abigail, and I'm very much looking forward to this one because it is about our local area history. All right, take care, everybody. I'll pop back later.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, Dan. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit in with us today. I'm coming at you from Northumberland County Archives and Museum, and you're set up in your HMS Speedy office, official headquarters, it looks like, so that's awesome. So for those who haven't had a chance at this point to check out your book at a local library or buy it from a local bookstore, would you like to just give a brief synopsis about the Wreck of HMS Speedy?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Glad to talk to you, Abigail. The Speedy is local lore, certainly around Brighton and Cobourg and Toronto, and it's Ontario history. Happened in 1804, so very early in our history, which means sometimes it gets forgotten. The Speedy was a British gunboat that sailed from York, which is now Toronto, to Newcastle, which was a town on Presqu'ile Point at that time, taking 20 people to conduct a murder trial. Big storm comes up, ship and people never seen again. So there was a mystery for 2 centuries that nobody knew where the ship ended up. It was just known that it was lost. And it was a huge disaster at the time. 20 people lost in a population of York at that time, but 450, and the Solicitor General of the province and a judge and lawyers. It was a terrible disaster at the time that it happened. And we get that idea only when we go back and look at the newspapers and documents of the time. And they mourned about it for decades afterwards. Population was small in those days, so everybody from Quebec to Windsor would have known someone who was on the ship. So it was a very major event at the time that it happened. And of course, I wanted to do the Speedy book at this time because there's a second part to that story. And that is in the early 1990s, a professional diver in Belleville named Ed Burt thought he might know where the remains of the Speedy were located. And he did diving out in Lake Ontario for 3 years in the early 1990s, looking for the remains of the Speedy. And he was pretty sure when he was finished that he had found them. Now, a lot of people didn't believe him, and nothing happened as a result of all that work. But he kept promoting the thing. I worked for him for a few years in the 2012-14 period. Unfortunately, Ed passed away in 2017. And a year later, his family, well, I received a phone call, and a couple hours later, there was a box of documents on my desk, and this was Ed's documents. And they thought, because I had worked with him for a while, and he trusted what I might do with the book. We talked about it, actually, to some degree. So they felt that I should have Ed's documents. And so at that point, I knew that, you know, my third book was going to be about the Speedy, so I could do both the historical story, which I'd wanted to do for a long time in the way that I've developed to do a history story, you know, focusing on the people and all the conflicts of the time and the social mores and all that, and then put final point on it, bringing it up to date with the information about the search for the Speedy. So, and it's come to fruition. It's great to see it out there, and people are reading it.
Yeah, well, I think anyone who's familiar with your past works just know the care that you take in the research process. And like from our perspective, it's total gold to see how you take you know, historical resources and turn them into a really detailed narrative that both, you know, balances, you know, just the story of people with historical facts. And so we can so appreciate that about your work. Would you like to go into how that process really works for you when you delve into the archival resources that are out there, knowing that this period, this early 1800s and before, you know, there's not a lot of detailed information out there.
Sure. It starts with all the information that we have about a story already. And in particular, the Speedy is low-hanging fruit, right? So it's a shipwreck, it's a disaster movie kind of thing. So I did research on how all of these stories have been written about the Speedy over the years, and I analyzed them. I found more than 45 different accounts of the Speedy story. But most of them are in the context of like a newspaper article, a magazine article, a column in a newspaper, that kind of thing. Some of them are fairly elaborate, but all of them are in that context. So they're short and they focus more on the salacious part of the story. And when you look at them in detail, they have different kind of features in them that we can question historically. But it's important to know these are written for entertainment. And so I always approach these kind of stories from the standpoint as I learn about that, but then I put them all aside. And I go back and look at the original documents, the most original documents related to this story that I can find. And of course, in our archive environment, especially in the Canadian archives, which has the British military records, there's thousands and thousands of documents there, just letters and charts and documents about the management of the provincial marine, the management of all these ships on the lake, day in and day out, for a decade or more before the Speedy happened in 1804 and afterwards. So you can understand from all that where the Speedy as a ship, as a resource in the government fit in, what its function was, and the people who were responsible for putting it there and managing it every day. So I have to have that context in order to tell the story. Then, of course, I also do the genealogy for the people who are involved. And there were about 20 people on the ship, and we know most of those people. Robert Gray was the Solicitor General, and Captain Paxton, of course, was the captain of the ship, and John Stegman, the surveyor, Thomas Cochrane, that judge who was going to preside at the trial. All these, each one of these people has a story, has a context in which this was their last job. And that's what they were. They were just doing their job. They were working. And so there was, I wanted to understand the context from a family history standpoint, from their jobs, their attitudes and whatnot, to give it a little more life. It's not just, you know, a bare history story like you'd hear in a lecture in high school. You know, this is a story of people. And it's a tragedy, so it puts an extra edge on the story. And of course, we have only a certain number of documents from that time period. But we can bring all of that together with our knowledge of human nature to give a kind of a picture of what these people were dealing with and what was happening around the time that the Speedy was lost and afterwards, and how it affected the community. So all the documents I can find are mostly digital form now. So it makes it so easy for me to sit here in my little apartment and just have access to all this stuff. And the problem is there's way too much information in that regard. So you really have to pare it down and pick and choose. But that was so much fun. To me, frankly, as a history geek, that is what's really fun about this kind of work, is finding all that stuff and piecing it together and making a coherent story out of all of that.
Yeah, I think we'd seen with the reference to like a shipment of peas, like things like that, where you've clearly like delved deep into these lists and, you know, picked out the ones that you know, are kind of fun. That was neat to see. Where this story is relatively well known in some capacity, as you said, it's a familiar story. Was there anything as you were doing this deeper research that actually really surprised you? Whether it was about the people or the events, you know, any of the players that were there that you just learned about and were surprised by?
I'm not sure surprised would be the right term. I was very interested in the aspect of these people, and we're talking professional people in their time who were doing their job, especially Captain Paxton, John Stegman, the surveyor, Thomas Cochrane, the judge. These people were part of the government infrastructure that was making the community grow. How they dealt with authoritarian government. Because we have to remember, at that time, it was still strictly colonial government, which means authoritarian. Sure, there was an executive council and a House of Assembly, but they had very little power. The people that had power was that governor, lieutenant governor, and on down from him. So you had to learn how to deal with that, to do your job as a surveyor or judge or whatever, keep in the good graces of the authority figures, but actually get your job done. And Thomas Paxton is a perfect example of that, where he had numerous run-ins with authority just in the process of him being a ship captain on Lake Ontario. He was disciplined several times, and it was usually because there was a storm came up, damaged the ship, and they always blamed the captain if any of the cargo was damaged or anything, like things like that. And he wasn't above complaining when not enough candles or firewood was available for his family, little things like that. But you could tell he was feisty, and he stood up for himself in a context where you could easily just be fired and kicked out and put in jail. I mean, the part in the story where he actually refused to sail. He didn't want to sail because he knew it was too dangerous to bring that many people out in the lake in October. He knew Lake Ontario, he'd been sailing there for decades. But of course, he had no choice because this was an imperative from the authority figures, and he had to do it. And as a result, he ended up losing his life because of it. But so there's numerous situations like this that came out of the documentation that show where these people had gumption and had a kind of a common sense about how to deal with authority but move forward themselves. I found that very interesting, and it demonstrates how there was the idea then about having more freedom. You know, Robert Baldwin was a little boy at that time. So decades later, the government situation would evolve. But in 1804, it was still very much an authoritarian government.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess that kind of can segue into, you know, that authoritarian government clashing up against the Indigenous communities that were affected by that colonialism. And, you know, this story really spans these 2 centuries. But really what struck me so much about the story is that, you know, things don't really feel like, I think it feels like this could have happened today, and it is happening today. The glaring difference in the application of the law and justice between, you know, the murder of John Sharp, the white trader, and the murder of Whistling Duck, the Mississauga man. And to me, it almost felt like that became the real tragedy of the story, that, you know, that I can connect that so well with contemporary events. I guess, like, what does this story really teach us about our society and structures today, you know, 200 years later?
Well, as a historian, I understand the various trends that are happening in a time and a place. You have to be able to do that in order to tell a story properly. I knew that this story was going to touch very strongly on Indigenous history, and as a result, I studied up on it a lot and contacted people directly who were involved in it. The main thing that came out of that research was that there was almost nothing in terms of documentation for that time period, for the place and time. Yeah, late 1790s, early 1800s, north of Lake Ontario, especially the Lake Scugog area. We knew that there were Mississauga people there and been there for some time. So the people I contacted, who were well-known historians and authors, they basically agreed with my assessment to say that, okay, we don't have anything from that time period. We have to go look at the writings later on of basically the Methodist ministers who were Indigenous people. Peter Jones is the obvious first, but there were several others, Copway and several others, that in the later period, in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, they wrote about their people's history in the context of their ministry, obviously. So you have to read kind of through the lines. But there was a lot of pictures there, stories there about how their families, how their parents lived, which would be around the time of the Speedy. So you got the idea about this, the seasonal aspect of their lives, coming from, you know, wintering in the north, coming to the lakeshore to their fishing in the summer, in the spring, because fishing was a major food source for them. They had huge fishing weirs at the mouth of most of the major rivers. And, you know, they had a whole organization where people, certain families would be responsible over time for maintaining the fishing weirs. And so this was a shared resource that everybody used. And then, of course, later on, they do the rice, harvest the wild rice. And we have to remember that Lake Scugog was a far larger wild rice resource than Rice Lake was. We remember Rice Lake for that now, but early on, before they basically destroyed the rice crop in Lake Scugog in 1830, this was a huge resource for them as well. So it was that whole lifestyle that kind of informed my approach to this. The fur trading post was a welcome thing for the Mississauga people because they needed the supplies, the cooking supplies, the cooking utensils and clothing and various things that you could, and hunting equipment and proper fish hooks and knives and things made their lives a heck of a lot easier. So they could do the fur trading. It was actually a pretty good business for them. Unfortunately, alcohol came into it, and the traders knew very well that they could do better financially if they traded for alcohol, although there was, depending on individual characters, that was controlled or not. But it was a presence at the time. And of course, those folks, and we have to remember, it's 1804, so it's only a decade into Upper Canada. They've been doing the fur trade for centuries before that. But this now, when the British had taken over and the United Empire Loyalists started to come in the 1780s, and really in this area, just in the early 1790s, they were only at the shore, at the lakeshore, a couple of concessions up from the lakeshore. So north of there was still pretty as it had been. So the Mississauga people were now seeing these new people camped near their fishing weirs. And now all of a sudden they were seeing, when they were walking down the natural trails they'd used for generations just to get to their fishing weirs, there's a guy with a musket and a dog saying, "This is my property now." And of course, the Indigenous people had no understanding that there was any ownership of land. That was an outrageous idea. Their chiefs were telling them, yes, we made this agreement that they could share the land. But of course, an English settler didn't understand the concept of share at all. It was ownership. I put up a fence. So there was a basic conflict, and it was just starting to kind of impact both sides just in the last few years from around 1804. We can see this in documents that Peter Russell was the administrator at this time, who they recorded speeches that the Indigenous chiefs made when they were complaining about all of these things. Oh, the settlers are shooting our dogs, they're wrecking our fishing weirs, they're not allowing us to get across our trails, please, bring the settlers into line, kind of thing. And of course, the answer to that is that they couldn't do anything about the settlers. They gave them more stuff. They basically gave them more stuff. And if you gave them more clothing and food and whatnot, that would kind of smooth the relationship over. It's not a sustainable thing, but that's the way it was at that time, is that the chiefs were very responsible men. They were trying to keep their young men in line. This Ogetonicut was a prime example of a young man who was angry, probably at his situation, angry that the settlers were coming in and pushing them off their land, and then his brother gets killed, and the whole cultural thing kicks into gear. A year before the Speedy thing happened, where the authorities said, oh, okay, we'll investigate this and we'll give you justice. But it turns out from their evaluation that it was self-defense, that the white settler had killed this whistling duck in a struggle, and it was self-defense. Of course, in the English system of justice, self-defense means there's no punishment, and actually nothing happens. In the Mississauga culture, that isn't even perception. All they knew was that the family had lost someone, and culturally what they always do is that the families get together, the family that lost and the family that was the perpetrator, they sit down and they have a negotiation and they work out a settlement. Had happened for centuries. It was a very important cultural aspect that they knew very well. And it was effective because what it not only did, it smoothed over a situation that bound these families together in actual relationships with each other, like financial relationships that would last for generations afterwards. So these two systems were not going to cooperate with each other or even try to understand each other. So as a result, a year later, Ogetonicut had seen nothing. The authorities wouldn't even talk to them about it. It was insulting to them. So he felt, as a young man, he felt responsible to maintain the honor of his family. And this is why when I explain the murder of John Sharp, it's well outside of the context of a simple burglary. It's pent-up anger that resulted in this. And so, yes, that the whole context of the Speedy is based around those events and those conditions. And I just felt it had to be explained as objectively as I can in that context. I mean, it's not what the book is about per se, but it's part of the story. It's part of the heritage that we should understand as being part of the story.
Yeah, no, it makes a powerful story beyond what maybe we would see, if you visit Presqu'ile Point at the OHT plaque there, you read that and it's a great synopsis, but you don't get that feeling of the people and what really went into this one event. So yeah, thank you for that. And I think readers will really enjoy that. So kind of fast forwarding a little bit now more as you do to the exploration of the site that may or may not allegedly be the Speedy. You've mentioned that Mr. Ed Burt, the commercial diver involved in that exploration, that he played actually a little bit of a role, a role in creating this kind of level of disinterest among maybe professional archaeologists and professionals across different fields. Do you see what impact do you see your book kind of having on maybe promoting this story further than ever has happened?
I can say plainly that my purpose in doing that last part of the book, the last few chapters about Ed Burt and the Speedy, was primarily to explain why Ed Burt was 99.99% sure he had found the remains of the Speedy. I can't say that he was right, but he was so sure of it, and he promoted it as from the standpoint of being sure about it, that I felt it was necessary to just explain why he was so sure. What was it based on? And now that I had his documents, his actual survey sheets that he made out each day when they were diving out there in Lake Ontario in 1990, 91, and 92, where he had to, it was a form the ministry gave him because he had a license for the place so that he could report back to them what he had done. And, it was the date and the time and the temperature and the weather and what equipment they had, who was out there and what they found and problems, all of that kind of stuff. So I could see the details of what they actually did. And this was very valuable because I had talked to Ed Burt about this. I'd been with him for several years in the Speedy Foundation in that period from 2012 to about 16 or so. Ed would only tell you what he wanted to tell you, and he wouldn't show us the documents. He was this old salt kind of guy. He had a treasure hunter mentality to him from a kind of a previous generation. And he felt that the documents were his ace in the hole, and that he didn't allow the information to come out to people only in bits and pieces that he felt was necessary to him to move it forward. But so, you know, that's why, and he'd never published anything, so this was all new information. And just with these documents and all the correspondence they had with the ministry and with others, I just needed to lay this out, because what it explains is, number one, the nature of Ed Burt. And he was a particular kind of character. A lot of people didn't like him because he was aggressive. He could be nasty. You could sit and have a beer with him, and he's nice as pie, but then if you said something just off, he would go red. You could see the red coming up in his neck, and he would say something really nasty, usually personal. He would do this sitting in a meeting with 4 or 5 people. And then a second later was ha, 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 and another topic. It was like, and everybody's sitting around rolling their eyes wondering what just happened. And people had experiences with him that, and he talked to people around Belville particularly, you know, you talk to somebody, raise the issues of, oh, that guy's a jerk, he's, oh, that, and oh, he's terrible. And he's, oh, he was my best friend. So it's no halfway with Ed Burt. You know? So, but the point being that he dealt with the archaeologists in the same way. And this was in the context of this big cultural change and a technical change happening in the archaeology community. Not just here, all across the world this was happening, where so many underwater archaeology sites had been completely destroyed or damaged by recreational divers during the 1970s and 80s. And people would just come and take stuff and put them in their backyard for souvenirs, destroying any historical value. So the archaeology community was really clamping down on this. The government, the ministry in Ontario and Canada was really cracked. All around the world this was happening, so it was a common thing, where rules were put in place that these recreational divers, or even professional divers like Ed, who were a lot more serious about it, couldn't remove anything from the water. That was the eventual option. That was the eventual objective. So Ed was doing this right in the middle of that change. He was the old guy that learned to be the explorer, knew about how to find things in the water. It was his job. He had an exploration and salvage company. So for him, you use all your expertise, you find something interesting. If it has historical value, you bring it up and you put it in a museum. That was his mindset. And he had lots of experience with that. Of course, he was bumping directly up against the notion that, okay, we don't want anybody to touch anything in these archaeology sites until the archaeologists do the science on it, so we get our historical value from it. And that changed from the first year, 1990, to the second year, 1991, of their diving project. Yeah. Because in the first year, they could have retrieved things, but they didn't find anything. The second year, they'd found things, but they couldn't retrieve them. Yeah. So Ed Burt was so annoyed with this, and I use very moderate language there. So he butted heads directly with the professional archaeologists. And as a result of this, and Ed could be really nasty. So the archaeologists, of course, they're professional folks. They have college degrees and all this kind of stuff, and they're backed up by a whole system in the government of policy. And their policy was in this direction, and Ed was in the other direction. So to them, Ed was just a cowboy, and you ignored him. You know, they thought he was a kook. It wasn't a little bit personal as well. And so as a result, nothing happened. And the conventional knowledge, and I use that term very clearly, the conventional knowledge that developed in the archaeological community and still remains is that there's nothing there, that Ed didn't find anything. Well, sorry, folks. You know, as a historian, I love nothing better than to tweak historical, conventional wisdom, because, we can learn more about our history if we kind of go outside the box a little bit. But this is very clear. So the documents allowed me to say, okay, folks, there's nothing there.
Yeah.
I don't know what's there. I don't know if it's from the Speedy, but it's nothing. And as long as professional marine archaeologists are not diving in the water over Dobbs Bank and going down and looking at those things, the mast, the bow, all of those, the cannonballs, the cannons, all those things, unless the science is done on those artifacts, and there's lots of science, boy, they have all sorts of technology and whatever to find out about those things. They could probably do most of it just by taking pictures. Use wonderful, camera, photographic equipment these days. Until that's done, this is always going to be a mystery. Of course, I'm not in the business of doing that. It's well above my pay grade, but it's my job as a historian simply to put the information that's available out there and let people know what the circumstance is, and that there is still work to be done in this project to eliminate, and I hate historical anomalies. This to me is a historical anomaly that could be removed if some work was done. Now, it's not simple, not cheap, so I'm going ahead with my next book. I'm not, working on this endlessly. And as I said in my presentations, I mean, does it matter? Does it really matter? And I got to, I always tell people as a historian, it doesn't really matter a lot to me. It'd be great to eliminate the mystery. As I said, it's add another little piece to the grand mosaic of Canadian history, as they call it. That'd be great. But I'm not going to stop telling the story and learning about Canadian history just because this mystery remains. It's such a rich story. And I just wanted more people to know about this part of Canadian history.
Well, Dan, I have so many more questions on that of like what could potentially be found that might, enrich this story further. What would we dream of to find that could tell us more? But I do believe that we'll need to stop it here for today. Thank you so much for your time. I think I have the book here, and I just have to say that people are Christmas shopping these days, and this is, I think, an excellent gift to put under the tree for pretty much anybody. And so I would encourage people to go out and find it. Dan, is there a particular shout out you'd like to make in that regard?
Well, the book's widely available. I always have to stifle a grin when I say that Indigo picked up this book from the early days, so it's across the country in the big bookstores. But of course, our small local bookstores are really important to communities, so please do business with them. I live in Brighton here, and we have one of the best local bookstores around, Lighthouse Books. They have lots of them signed. But whatever, there's all sorts of ways to get a book these days. There's an ebook in the Kobo system. I've created a 5-part video series on my website that for folks who don't necessarily read books, you can get the same story from the video. So I haven't done an audiobook yet. That's the only thing remaining to be done, but it's widely available, so pretty easy to get. So, and it's a great Christmas present. You're exactly right.
It really is. It looks beautiful, and it's informative. So, but thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate talking to you, and I'm sure we'll be in touch again. I'll see you knocking on the door of the archives for our next project hopefully soon.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you both Abigail and Dan for taking the time to do this for the Cobourg Public Library. We appreciate it very much. And again, we do have a copy of it here at the library, but please get out there and support your local bookstores and purchase a copy and support Dan. And if you like what you've seen, please head over to his social media or his website to learn more. Thanks, everyone.